Hi everybody, welcome to Gender Relations and Economics. In this series, I look at some of the many ways that gender relations matter in economic outcomes and processes, and how the economy and economics matter in gender relations. Today's video, we're talking about macroeconomics, which is a very exciting and big field, so I hope you'll find it interesting. As with all of the other topics that I cover in this series, there's a lot of literature, there's a lot of work being done in this field, and so I can't cover all of it in these videos. This is particularly true on the topic of macroeconomics. I'm not a macroeconomist, and so my knowledge here is relatively limited. But I did want to put together a video with some at least introductory or what I would consider basic points when we think about gender relations and macroeconomics. So there are three things that I want to talk about in this video. The first is the question, what does gender have to do with macroeconomics at all? Is this related to macroeconomics and how? And I'll give some first thoughts and impressions on that. The second point that I'll make is I want to show you a stylized fact about gender relations and economic development. And from that, I think we can start to understand a lot about how gender matters in macroeconomics. And the third point is I will tell you something about gender budgeting, which, spoiler alert, is the idea of thinking about how government spending affects gender inequality or gender equality, or if it's gender neutral. So let's start with the overall question. What does gender have to do with macroeconomics? Just a little story. When I was in graduate school, one of my classes in macroeconomics, the professor was James Hines, who's somebody who's working on gender and macro. He had a whole week on gender and macro. And one of my colleagues, who was a macroeconomist, not a gender interested person per se, he raised his hand and he said, why are we talking about this? You know, he can really see why you talk about gender when you think about labor markets, when you think about household economics, but he didn't get the point of why we think about it when we talk about macroeconomics. And I think that that's how a lot of economists might see this issue. And so this video might help explain some of the points. I thought about a few different issues, what macroeconomists are interested in, what they look at, what they care about, and I just want to explain some of the ways that those things are also related to gender. So one of the first questions that macroeconomists ask is, how big is the economy, right? What is the GDP of an economy? This is related to gender in many ways. First, when we think about what's counted in GDP, we also have to think about what's missing. So one of the core ideas in feminist economics is that care work, unpaid housework, that work is essential for an economy, and that it is not recognized as economically productive means that measures like GDP, which measure only the value of goods and services produced in a country in a certain amount of time, really miss a lot of economic activity that's happening in that country. This big macroeconomic question, how big is GDP, misses actually a lot of economic activity. There's a nice sort of thought experiment here. If you think about a housekeeper who's paid to clean a house or take care of kids, that money, that work is part of GDP. But if the housekeeper marries her employee and keeps doing the same work, that work is no longer considered in GDP. So when we think about it like that, we start to see, okay, this is economically important work, but we're not valuing it with measures like GDP. Another gender issue is that GDP is not the same as human development, right? GDP misses ideas about literacy in an economy, health, infant mortality. There are correlations between income of a country and these issues of human development, but it's an imperfect correlation. These things are unequally distributed by gender. So education is unequally distributed by gender, health is as well. And so when we don't talk about these issues in terms of when we think about the macro economy, then we're missing a lot of gender specific issues. In general, one can say that these questions of GDP, and even if we have, you know, an overall rate of what is the health of an economy, what is the health of the people in the economy, those questions ignore the distribution of resources and income within countries, which is very often gender skewed. There are some quality of life indices that do take into account things like health and literacy and things like that. Most of them don't take account of gender at all. One of them does. There's a gender inequality index, and there are a couple others. Those kind of indices are good because they start to bring in the question of, when you ask how is an economy doing, how is a country doing economically, brings in the question of how specifically are women doing relative to men in political participation, in health, in education, in income, in labor force participation. And those things matter when you think about the health of an overall economy. So a second thing that macroeconomists care about, that they're interested in measuring, is employment, as well as unemployment and underemployment. And here a big question is, who are the people in these different groups, right? Who's mostly employed? It's men who are in formal employment more than women. Who's unemployed? Also, they're men. Who's underemployed? Women. And who's working but not in the formal labor market? That's women, right? So there's gender distribution in these categories. It's also important when we think of what macroeconomists care about when they think about employment, is the sectors in which people work, and how these different sectors, how these groups of people contribute differently to GDP. So thinking about the gender specific issues in those questions, there are a few points to be made. One, women are much more likely to work part-time, right? Because there's social norms that say that women should do more of the childcare, should do more of the housework and things like that. And so women are more likely to be working part-time, and also much more likely to be working fewer hours than they say they would like to be working. So we can't just have a measure of employment without also understanding underemployment and who is underemployed. A second point is that unemployment is something that's much more populated by men. And when women lose their jobs or stop working, they're much more likely to just leave the labor market and instead do unpaid work in their families or in their homes. A third point is occupational segregation. So a overall aggregate measure of employment misses the idea that there's occupational segregation, that some parts of the population are more likely to be in certain jobs in other sectors than others. And there we know very clearly from the data that women are much more likely to be in public sector employment, and men are more likely to be in private sector employment, and men are more likely to be in jobs around manufacturing, construction, and IT. And this becomes important later on. Another point here is the question of what is work, right? So when macroeconomists ask what is the employment rate in a country, that ignores the question of what is work. This is something I talk about a lot in the video on household economics. If we think about work as what we do for pay, then yeah, it's mostly men who are working. But if we have a different definition of work, for example, I like the third-party criterion definition, which is the idea that if you can pay somebody else to do something for you, then it's work. That allows us to see things like care work and housework as work. And macroeconomists in measuring employment miss that work. And that's a very gendered ignorance. The last point that I'll make when we talk about work and employment as something macroeconomists care about is that in developing countries, labor force participation is likely to not measure women's economic well-being, because there's a lot of informal work being done by women, especially in developing countries. This is not, labor force participation doesn't tell us the whole picture of how women are experiencing the economy. So instead, if we really want to know about how women are doing in the economy, it would be meaningful to instead look at indicators of things like education or health. Okay, a third thing that macroeconomists care about is price changes, inflation and deflation. And here, a gender-relevant point is to ask the question, does one group pay more from inflation than another group? And indeed, that is the case. There are some studies that show that low-income households spend more of their money, so given what they consume, given their consumption bundle, more of their money is spent on keeping up with inflation because a greater share of what they purchase is on goods that have higher inflation rates. This is relevant by gender because women are more likely to be low income, and women are more likely to be living alone or be single parents, and these are low income households. And so these households are more affected by price increases. So that's a gender-specific effect that you don't see a lot about in the literature at all, but certainly matters for people's day-to-day lives. A fourth point when we think about what macroeconomists care about is something like public debt, right? So what does it matter when a government has a lot of debt? There we can also bring in questions of gender. When we ask, who benefits and who pays when there's excessive public debt, 2 points to be made here. The first is that when you cut government spending to counteract public debt, then that cut is more likely to affect women. As I said before, women are more likely to be in public employment. And so when you have big cuts to government spending, then it's women's jobs who are more at risk. Women are also more likely to be the benefactors of public spending. They're more likely to be on welfare. They're more likely to be receiving assistance from the government exactly because of gender pay gaps, exactly because of a disproportionate responsibility of childcare. And so when governments cut spending on those kinds of programs, it is women who are disproportionately negatively affected. A second point to be made here is in the context of developing countries. Very often when you have a structural adjustment program where international groups or other countries who want to be involved in the reshaping of how developing countries work, very often these structural adjustment programs will say the government has to cut spending. So it's true in developing countries as well that women are disproportionately affected by such government spending cuts. And so these structural adjustment programs are gendered. A fifth thing that macroeconomists care about is trade, economic trade. 2 points to be made here about gender, how gender matters in these questions. So one is about access to newly emerging export markets, right? The access to jobs or work in newly emerging sectors will be very dependent on things like a person's human capital, how much education a person has, how much access to education the person had, which has everything to do with social norms about who can go to school, who can get training in different fields, who, based on social norms, is allowed to work at all for pay. Access to different fields is also dependent on access to information. So, do you even have the networks to know about new opportunities or new jobs? Access to and control over assets like land and energy and physical and financial capital. Those things might not be equally distributed at all. There's a lot of work that I've seen, especially looking at African countries, that show that the access to resources for agriculture are not distributed equally between men and women because the social norms say that men should be in charge of one set of resources and women another set. I'm sure that there's plenty of work out there from other countries showing gender-specific access to different markets. But this is one gender-specific point when we talk about trade, the access of men and women to newly emerging markets. Another point to be made here when we talk about trade is linked to household economics. This is something also that I talk about in my video on gender relations and household economics. In the literature, in the economics literature on the households, there's either explicitly or sometimes just implicitly an assumption that households pool resources, right? That, let's say, a couple, two people in a household just pool their income and share it as they need or equally. This is not true in developed countries. This is even less true in developing countries. And so a lot of our macroeconomic models about how households work with this assumption of resource pooling don't do justice in developing countries. Okay, the last point that I'll make about what macroeconomists care about and how we can think about these things in gender-specific terms is, of course, the growth or the health of an economy. And here the question is, what policies can stimulate growth and which policies help an economy? And then the gender-specific question is, who benefits from these policies and who benefits from resulting growth? Here I have a couple of examples. So think about stimulus to expand infrastructure, right? This is something that happened after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Then I was living in the United States, and there was a lot of investment in infrastructure. A lot of roads started being constructed and new buildings started being constructed. That particular economic policy stimulates growth in the aggregate, but think about who gets those jobs. Who works in construction? That's mostly men. And so those policies have gender-specific consequences as well, which is exactly the point of gender budgeting, which I'll talk about later in the video. In general, the ability to weather an economic downturn, so if we think about growth and the health of an economy, in general, households deal with economic shocks and economic downturns very differently. It's much harder for single households where there's only one income to deal with crises, because if a single person loses their job or their hours are cut, then they're alone in dealing with it. Two-person households can weather economic crises on average better. And of course, women are more likely to live alone, and women are also more likely to live alone with their kids. And so it's much harder for women to deal economically in times of economic downturns. There's really a very big literature on economic growth and development that relates to gender. I wouldn't do it any justice to talk much about it, although I will show you a stylized fact in 1 minute, but there's really so much out there, so many interesting questions. For example, what is the relationship between female empowerment and economic growth? Is it that female empowerment stimulates economic growth? You know, if you give women more rights, then women can enter the labor force, women can get education, and that's good for the economy, so the economy grows? Or is the causation the other way around? Is it that the economy grows and therefore women have access to the labor market? The direction of causality there is not clear. It's an interesting conversation in the literature, so maybe you're interested in checking that out. It's a good segue into the second point that I want to make in today's video. Namely, I just want to show you one stylized fact about women's labor force participation and economic growth. And I think talking about it shows some very interesting ways that gender relations matter in the economy. A very nice paper that I like on exactly this topic is from Mammon and Paxson from 2000. They show empirically, using data from dozens of countries over many years, that there's a U-shaped relationship between economic development and women's labor force participation. So at very low levels of development, women are actually working a lot. And as an economy grows, and we enter low and middle levels of development, women's labor force participation drops down. And then only at higher levels of development does women's labor force participation grow again. This is a stylized fact in the literature in paper after paper. I bring up Mammon and Paxton's paper exactly because I think they have a really nice discussion about why this is happening. So the first thing is that at very low levels of development, women are economically active, very economically active, but primarily in farm and in non-farm family enterprises. So they're doing a lot of work, but it's not on former labor markets working for somebody else, right? It's mostly family oriented and own farm oriented work. But then as an economy grows, there are more jobs being opened up in the formal labor market. And Mammon and Paxton talk about sequencing here. So who gets these kinds of formal jobs first, right? And who gets to move from agriculture to the formal labor market? The interesting thing that they show and their explanation for why there's this U-shaped relationship is that as the economy grows and these jobs become available, it's men who are able to enter the labor market, the formal labor market. But that means that men are leaving their family area. The women then have to take care of their children and their households and can no longer sustain with family production because the man is now in a formal employment situation. And so women leave economic activity, paid economic activity, in order to take on care work. And then it's first as the economy grows even more that sequencing allows that women can take up the formal jobs. One of the other interesting things that Mammon and Paxton talk about is they talk a lot about social norms about who can get which jobs. The blue collar jobs, the more manual labor jobs, those are reserved for men because of social norms in many developing countries. Another interesting thing here is that when women can enter the labor force, they're not supposed to take factory jobs if they are married. It's unmarried women who can take factory jobs, but not married women, because if married women have factory jobs, then it's often seen as shameful to their husbands, because if the married women are working in these jobs, it means that the husbands couldn't provide for them economically. So this is a nice example of intersectionality. This is something I talk about in the feminist economics video, where you can't just take, the group of men and the group of women and say that results and processes, that's all the same for everybody in the group. This is an example of how that's not true. It's not all women who can take these jobs in factories, it's only unmarried women. And married women, because of social norms, can't, right? And there are so many other dimensions of intersectionality, so many other dimensions of our identities that matter in our economic lives, like our age, our education, the education of our parents, our race, our caste, our skin color, and on and on and on. And I like this example of marital status as one of the dimensions of identity that matter. So the fundamental question here, which is interestingly also a big question in developed countries, is does the pay from the formal labor market justify a woman leaving the home to take that job, right? What's the opportunity cost of taking the job if you don't have any support for taking care of kids and taking care of a household? Then it's the cost of the work that you would be doing at home. And so that becomes a big question of who takes care of the kid. The final point that Mammon and Paxton make in this U-shaped relationship is that as the economy grows even more, then more white collar jobs become available. And as white collar jobs become available, there's growth in the demand for women's work also in these jobs. So that's why we see such a big growth of women's labor force participation at higher levels of economic development. The last thing that I'll talk about in this video is gender budgeting. This is also called gender responsive budgeting. And this is one form of what's called gender mainstreaming. And in general, gender mainstreaming is the idea that you have to assess, or you ought to assess, any policy, any plan in terms of its gender specific effects. You can think about equality or inequality in terms of many different things. You can think about it in terms of income, you can think about it in terms of employment, in terms of unpaid work. You can think about it in terms of capabilities. That's a big conversation in the feminist economic literature on macroeconomics, is capability. So what is it that people are capable of doing? Do they have access to education? Do they have access to political participation? Are they capable of being a full economic agent? I want to give an example of gender budgeting and how to understand it. This is something that I took from James Heinz's book, The Economy's Other Half, which is definitely an interesting book if you're interested in macro and gender issues. And so he writes about how spending on basic infrastructure in low-income countries has gender-specific consequences. Namely, women spend a lot of time collecting water in developing countries. And if the government decides to provide a water tap, it has huge effects on women in particular, because they're the ones who are collecting the water. And so they have now a lot more time to do something else. This is a nice example of how we can think about the gender-specific effects of government projects, government spending in different countries. Gender budgeting really entered the literature as something that people think about in the 1980s. A pioneer country who was doing really good things with gender budgeting already at that time in the 80s was Australia. By the 1990s and the early 2000s, gender budgeting had become something that was really common to talk about in international organizations, also in many countries in country level policy briefs. And in some ways it's been effective and helpful, but a lot of, especially feminist economists and other economists interested in inequality, say that in a lot of ways gender budgeting is lip service, right? It just says this might be the effective for men and women, but still the policy is implemented, right? Or ignoring some of the other dimensions that matter, but that stuff doesn't get written up in reports. And so it's great that the concept is there. It would be even better if countries did more to implement it. I want to make now just 3 more points about gender budgeting. One is that the language that we use to talk about economic decisions matters. So very often in the media, when you think about government decisions to spend money on infrastructure, building new buildings, building new roads, investing in technology, very often those things are talked about as investments, right? Investment in infrastructure. At the same time, governments and media often talk about the expenditures of, having to pay for education, having to pay for preschools and nursery care. The thing is, though, those things are also investments. They're investments in human capital, which are really important for the economy. If you have well-educated children, then your economy is going to do better. But very, very often, those things are talked about as expenditures, while roads and technology are talked about as investments. Why does this matter? Because who works in roads and technology? That's men. So the investment goes to men. And the expenditure, which is often seen as something not great, that's for things like school. And who works in schools? That's women. And so even the way that we talk about government spending has some kind of connotation of, is this something that we want to do? Right? Do we want to invest? Yes. Do we want to have lots of expenditures? No. There's a political connotation about what kind of government spending is good and what kind is not as desirable. There's an example of gender budgeting that I often like to show. In the city in which I live, Vienna, there are stickers on public transportation vehicles, so on trams and in the subway and on buses. And these stickers show 4 different types of people who get priority seating. So originally, everywhere in Vienna and all the public transport, we saw this picture. It's of 4 people. There's an older person, a blind person, somebody with a baby on their lap, and a pregnant person. The interesting thing about these original stickers is that the first 2 people, the old person and the blind person, are pretty clearly connotated as men. The person with a baby is pretty clearly signaled as a woman, and the pregnant person is also a woman. At some point around 2000, early 2000s, feminists in Vienna said, hey, you know, this isn't really okay because this is just reinforcing stereotypes, especially first that the universal person, so an old person and a blind person, anybody can be old, anybody can be blind, that universal person should not always be a man. And the person with the baby should not always be a woman. So that just reinforces gender norms about who is universal and who is a caretaker. And so the city of Vienna, or the so-called Wiener Linien, the public transport company that runs the public transport in Vienna, put in these new stickers. And in these stickers, the old person is a woman, the blind person is a woman, the person with a baby is a man, the pregnant person is still signaled as a woman. And this is an example of gender budgeting because, you know, the government, or it's actually the organization in Vienna who runs the public transportation, they print these stickers, right? So they're spending money on printing stickers. The question is just, what do you want to put on the stickers? It's not a huge deal. It's not a huge investment to change the stickers, right? Because you have to change the stickers every once in a while anyway because of wear and tear. But the point is that the stickers also transmit social norms and transmit ideas about roles. I can't tell you how many times I sat in public transportation and saw a kid sitting on a parent or a caretaker's lap talking about the stickers and describing what they see. And they say, oh, here's a child with their father, for example. And so these things do matter, right? People do take in ideas about what's normal in society from the images that we see around us. And so this is an example of money being spent that, however much or however little, we'll never know exactly the effect of these stickers, but in some way contributing or trying to contribute to gender equality. The last point I'll make about gender budgeting here is, this is a point made by Joyce Jacobson in her book, An Advanced Introduction to Feminist Economics, which is really a great book. So she makes the point that economists, professional economists, very often in the sort of spirit of the profession, how we're trained, economists are very likely to disapprove of government spending. Economists on average, and we see this in surveys of economists on average want less government intervention. And this of course also has gender specific implications, as we talked about before. You know, it's women who benefit from government spending more than men. And so when economists are more likely to say less government spending, we don't want the government involved, then it's an entire profession of economics saying inadvertently less support for women, right? That's not what they're saying, and no, I'm sure none of them would say we want less support for women, but when they say we want less government spending, that is the result and that is the outcome. There were some points that I wanted to give you on gender relations and macroeconomics. As always, there's a lot more to learn, but I hope that this was an informative and helpful introduction to the topic. If you liked it, you might be interested in the other videos in the series on gender relations and different aspects of economics. All the best, be well.